Hello everyone, welcome to Caroline Nutrition. This is episode 9, Sugar, sweet, sweet sugar. I'm your host Ian Cath and I'm the one with the interest and questions. To help us have the best that food has to give, health, vitality and enjoyment, and to help me make some sense of this crazy world that we have and all the information out there, I'm joined with Caroline Scott, nutritionist and dietitian and the person with the answers to your questions. Caroline, welcome to the episode about sugar.
Thanks, Ian. Good to be here, making some sense out of all that crazy information out there.
Yes, and we decided to crack sugar. Why today?
Well, I thought it was your idea.
Well, it is my idea because sugar is one of those topics that's very topical at the moment.
Well, it's always topical, but yes, over the last little while it's been gathering steam, so it's probably just as good a time to deal with it as any.
Yeah, and I thought maybe the best place to start, and hey, get back to me if you think differently, Caroline, but I thought maybe we should have a look at what is sugar and basically define it, I suppose. How do we approach this?
Oh my goodness, you don't want us to launch in with science already, do you?
Well, I don't know. What's sugar? You're like, okay, I know of some sugars, but I certainly don't know the complexity of it. I know that the crystalline white table sugar that we use, or raw sugar, stuff that comes from sugarcane, or in the northern hemisphere, sugar beets and the like, that's table sugar. I know honey's a sugar. I imagine there's lots of others, but
there are.
It is deeper than that, isn't it?
Much, much deeper than that. And sadly, there is so much confusion about it that it's become an issue and something that we need to talk about now and explain. So you're right, let's define sugar first, because we use the word sugar for so many different things that it's actually quite confusing when we try to break the messages down into the foods that means we should be eating and foods that we could potentially avoid. If we're going to call everything sugar, it's really confusing. So if you look at sugar in its natural form, as you were saying, the plants that grow in the fields that we extract and process and heavily refine, and we create sucrose out of those foods. So whether that's the cane sugar in the fields here around us, or up in the north hemisphere, as you say, the sugar beet, that they create sucrose once they've been heavily refined. And sucrose is not just pure sugar. Sucrose is what we call a disaccharide, which means there are two little sugars, two tiny molecules that have been jammed together. And those molecules are glucose and fructose. And we've all heard that language.
Yep.
So
glucose is what my mum used to mix with icing sugar to make icing to put on fruitcakes.
Goodness, okay. Wow, that would have been quite strong. So glucose is your one monosaccharide. It's the one tiny little molecule all on its own. And glucose is incredibly important because it actually appears in the human body. Glucose appears whether we eat it or not. So we can actually synthesize and create glucose in our system, and we need it. We use it in great part for our energy. So glucose is something that's really necessary for us. And we can obviously break down many of the foods that we bring in to the body, and we can extract these tiny little singular molecules of glucose from many, many foods that we bring in. Then you move into other natural sugars like fructose, which appears highly in fruit, and it's a natural fruit sugar. And again, it's a one little molecule. And again, we need fructose in our body as well, in very small amounts, but it's actually necessary for part of our energy pathways. So we have to have some of it. And then there are other things like if we drink dairy milk, you'll find the sugar in dairy milk is lactose. There's a sugar in malt called maltose. There's a whole range of them. And so when we use the word sugar, you almost have to kind of define what it is that you're talking about. And that's why the conversation, I think, has become incredibly complicated over the last couple of years, particularly when it comes to health messages and to which foods we're actually meaning when we say sugar. I think it's fair to say we're not talking about table sugar anymore when we say sugar.
Okay, so just to help me here, you just mentioned glucose and fructose and lactose and what was the other one?
Maltose.
Maltose. Are they necessary for our survival? Are they good or are they evil? You know,
Oh, no, you can't label them that. These are naturally occurring. And so you cannot have dairy milk from a cow without lactose, because lactose is the sugar that's within the dairy milk. No one's put it there. It's there naturally. And it's like fructose happens to be in fruit. It grows. That's the way it grows. So it's a natural fruit sugar. And you can't have the fruit without that in it. It's a part of it. And that's why we have these really complicated conversations where we all get really confused. What we ought to do, perhaps, is use the proper name. So perhaps we ought to talk about lactose and fructose and glucose. But most of us don't really have that kind of chemical understanding. And of course, the food companies don't ever want to have to start putting on their labels really what's in their products, so they hide it under all sorts of things. At the moment, most people don't realise that if you read on a nutrition label a word that ends in OSE, it means sugar. But most people don't realise that, so they gloss over it. And so food companies can get away with not having to claim too much because, sure, they've put the word there, but because we don't know what it is, we don't actually know what we're eating or what's in that product. But then perhaps I'm being a bit harsh. Perhaps food companies wouldn't want to confuse us like that. Maybe they really want to tell us the truth all the time. Ha.
So there's a list of sugars that you were just talking about that occur naturally, but some of these are more refined than others, aren't they?
Well, they're only refined when they have been refined. So the ones that we were just talking about, the glucose, fructose, lactose, they're totally and absolutely natural. They're not refined at all. They are already in the foods. And that's how they appear in nature. The sugars that particularly are refined, and this moves then into the area of are these so good for us? They're refined because the plants that they grow in naturally have been processed and refined. So that takes us back to sucrose, which has been processed through refining sugarcane and sugar beet that we talked about. So that sucrose is a combination. It's a disaccharide. So it's two molecules of natural sugars, glucose and fructose, stuck together. And this is not natural. So it's only natural. It's only appearing in a plant because it's been heavily processed and refined. So this is not natural to us, and it doesn't appear in our body in this way. And that's where really it's an additional chemical to the body. So this is the thing that you don't want.
Okay, so what do these sugars do in our bodies? The ones that are somewhat manipulated, like you just said, and also the more natural ones. So
the natural sugars, because they come and they're found in foods naturally, they come in the food, in the packet, with all of, so I don't mean packet as in, a plastic wrap. I mean, let's talk about fruit for a moment because it's kind of easy. When we're talking about fructose, the simple fruit sugar, it comes in nature with all the beautiful fibre, minerals, vitamins and other phytonutrients that grow within that plant. And so when we eat the sugar in this way, we're eating all of those other things. And that's designed to help our body to assimilate the sugars as easily as we assimilate the fibre, the minerals, the vitamins. And we won't be excessive when we eat it in that form. But as soon as you go and process it and you bring in a disaccharide like sucrose, you've stripped away anything else that was useful. You've taken away the fibre, the minerals, the vitamins, the phytonutrients, and now all you're bringing in is this sugar, which has a dire impact on the body, on our hormones, on our blood sugar levels, on our arteries, on our inflammatory levels in the body. So it has a dire impact, and that's because we're eating and overeating an excess of an unnatural chemical that has been created through a refining process.
So you just mentioned about blood sugar there. I imagine this is one of the important aspects of sugar, or maybe difficult parts of sugar too.
Well, this is one of the effects that sugar has on the body, and this is one of the impacts. And of course, this is where immediately the message about sugar out in the diet there gets really, really confusing. So when we eat sugar of any sort at all, it will impact, and I'm going to use different words here, so bear with me. It's going to impact our blood glucose levels. So glucose is, as I've already mentioned, the simple sugar. We find it in nature, but we find it in our body. And we need it in our bloodstream. We use it for energy, basically. Our brain uses it for energy, our tissue cells, everything uses it for energy. And we always want a certain level, and you'll always find a certain level of glucose in our blood at any one time. That level is impacted upon as we introduce sugars into our diet. So as we're eating sugars in the foods that we're consuming, that will impact our blood glucose levels. It'll either make them higher. Generally, it won't make them lower to start with, but it will make them higher. Now, as our blood glucose levels increase through that breakdown of foods in our gut, our body, to help us balance our blood glucose levels, because you can't have high blood glucose levels, the body has only a narrow tolerance to the amount of glucose in our blood. And this takes us all the way back to, which one was it? Which episode where we talked about diabetes? Because we're going to touch on diabetes here, because if you can keep your blood glucose levels stable, the world is good. Your energy levels are great, your brain function, focus, concentration, everything's feeling great, and inflammation is under control. But as soon as we have too much glucose in the system, and we've got too much glucose because we're converting a lot of the sugars that we bring in through the diet into blood glucose levels, as soon as that happens and they push over a certain level, the body has this kind of negative feedback system so that it doesn't get dangerous for our body and it doesn't create too much inflammation or damage in our arteries, that kind of thing, by releasing insulin. Now, remember we talked about this. Insulin's created in the pancreas, and it's a hormone, and it's released when we have way too much blood glucose in our blood system. And so the body immediately sends out insulin to save our life, and it goes and grabs hold of that blood glucose and it stores it in various places. It will store a whole bunch in your liver. It will convert it to something else, but there's a storage capacity. It will store it in all your tissues. It will store it. It will take a lot to the brain. It will feed all the other organs of the body. But the problem becomes when there's an excess. And so the excess of blood glucose gets stored as fat in your fat cells. And this is where we see sugar being converted to fat. And so most people out there think that when they eat fat, they'll get fat. And that's totally inaccurate. It's when you eat sugar, you'll get fat.
Now, we've talked about this before in previous episodes, and the myth that was perpetrated throughout the 50s through to the 80s about reducing the amount of fat in your diet because you want to get rid of cholesterol, and sugar wasn't even an issue. And it looks like it's exactly the inverse. Bearing in mind, it's got to be healthy fats, as we discussed in the last couple of episodes.
Yeah, the message is not totally the inverse, and this goes back to where, you and I are always having this debate about things being black and white, and things are never, as you were always pointing out to me, things are never black and white. So it's not the complete inverse, but it is very much along the lines of, we shouldn't be restricting fat in our diets. We should embrace fat, and we should be eating healthy fats, and we perhaps can cover that next time. We need to eat the healthy fats. We talked about that with the brain. But in terms of having too high a level too consistently of blood glucose, we know this is harmful because this eventually creates diabetes, but it's also creating an awful lot of inflammation along the way. And we already know that inflammation in the body, again, at a consistent level, can create a disease state and breakdown. So it's the one thing that you don't want to be doing. We don't want a lot of simple or complex sugars in the diet because they break down too easily into glucose. And we just cannot process that high level of glucose, so we convert it in the body to fat, and in particular we convert it into triglycerides, which are the fats that go around in the blood and actually cause an awful lot of damage in the body.
Which is the exact inverse story that we were told about reducing fat, and that sugar wasn't even on the radar. It seems that sugar does make a real problem for cardiovascular disease. Yeah,
sugar does make a huge problem for cardiovascular disease. And it's not that the fat story said that sugar wasn't involved. They just didn't mention it.
Right.
And so by neglecting to mention it, it's not involved. But they didn't say it wasn't involved. All they said was, and when I say they, the so-called experts that were behind this little cover story, was that they were suggesting that it's all about fat. So they just weren't giving us the whole story. And they're not totally inaccurate. If you were to eat a high-fat diet where it was completely saturated fat or damaged fats, yes, you're still going to have a major problem. So it's not that they were totally 100% wrong either, but they certainly didn't give us the total story. I'm a bit frustrated with this them and us and the black and white kind of ideas that we've got around our diets today. It's not giving us the whole story, so therefore it's making something evil when it really isn't.
Okay. So let's just give up sugar. I'm going to get rid of the sugar that I put in my cup of tea or my coffee.
You did that ages ago.
Yeah, I know. I'm speaking figuratively.
Okay.
We're going to put the sugar bowl away and we're going to stop eating glazed donuts and all's going to be good, right? Done and dusted. Sugar's out of my life and you just watch the weight drop off now. Is this the way it works?
Yeah, no, sadly not. And we had this conversation before we started recording, didn't we? Because I see a lot of clients who have that thinking, okay, let's get rid of obvious sucrose, which is your table sugar. Let's get rid of the white stuff, brown stuff. It makes no difference really what any of them are. They're all sugar. So it's not just about that. It's also, and this is the bit where controversy has been created, because it's not just those simple that simple form of sugar that you can see now. Sugar comes in many of the foods that we buy, not even necessarily the natural foods, the whole foods that we're eating in terms of our fruit and veg, but it comes in all of the food that's out of the supermarket, that's packaged, processed, our breads, our yogurts, our muesli bars, our cereals, anything that we eat generally on a daily basis, when you start to look at the nutrition label, is laden with sugar. And so you can very quickly tot up a huge level of sugar intake, even though you're not adding table sugar to your tea and coffee every day. And that I think really that is our major problem, and that's where the confusion is coming from, is that we don't understand that when we eat a yogurt, that everyone thinks, oh, yogurt's such a great food. And I go, no, if you're buying it from the supermarket, it is not a great food, and you really need to check the label for the amount of sugar in it. And that's where that movie, that sugar film, came from, and that was the point that the filmmaker Damon was suggesting, talking about, is that even when you're eating a diet that you think is healthy, it's actually here in Australia incredibly high in sugar.
Yeah, it was something that really shocked me. I actually went and saw the premiere of it here in Brisbane, and they had a Q&A at the end of it with Damon there, and I was shocked at how even I was getting it wrong. And I've been very conscious about this since my early 20s, about not having too much sugar in my diet. And I thought I was doing really well, and until I saw the program and I realised the depth of the hidden sugars within our foods. And I always thought that if I ate a healthy food product that was deemed healthy, that there was almost no sugar in it by definition, because that's what healthy was. And that's what that sugar film taught me, was there is staggering amounts of sugar. It's not just a little bit. It's not just a small enhancement of sugar. It is huge quantities of sugar. And I was devastated by that. And frankly, it was a huge epiphany for me, because I just step away from it, and I've completely changed my diet. And I've had some wonderful benefits from it too, which we might talk about in time. So yeah, those hidden sugars, I think, are really, really significant within a lot of the processed foods.
Exactly, and that's the point. And this is where it becomes sadly contentious and controversial and confusing for the majority of people. And because we still keep using the word sugar to cover everything we're talking about, I think this is what I think anyway, is that people easily get confused. So when I use the word sugar to mean glucose, which naturally occurs in our body, or when I use the word sugar to mean fructose, which occurs naturally in fruit, and then I use the word sugar in bread, and people immediately look at you and go, no, what's happening?
As in fairy bread, the white bread with the butter on it and the sugar sprinkled on top.
No, even just, a simple piece of white bread. When you look at the sugar the sugar composition of it, it's quite high in sugar. And the reason it's high in sugar...
Are you talking about the sugar that's added? Like a lot of, say, Vietnamese bread has sugar added to it?
If you let me finish. No, I'm talking about, because it's a simple carbohydrate food, that when we actually go through the fire of digestion and it gets broken down in the gut, it's going to produce huge amounts of glucose. Now, remember, go back to the episode we did on diabetes, and we didn't spend a lot of time on it, but we touched on the glycemic index. And we were saying that how certain carbohydrate foods break down at different rates, and they have different levels of glucose in them. And this impacts our glucose levels in our blood. So it comes back to the whole glucose-insulin balance story again. So it can become confusing when people, and particularly that sugar film, talked about carbohydrate foods. And so suddenly now people are getting confused between sugar and carbohydrate. And I think this is one of the reasons that we have the confusion out there today. People no longer know what to eat because they're also hearing the message, reduce your carbohydrate foods. And people often don't know what a carbohydrate is. And I'm only suggesting this because this is what my clients come in to see me about, and they often don't understand what a carbohydrate is. They kind of get what fat is, and they kind of know what protein and where that comes from. But carbohydrate, they're not really sure. So when I sit down and start to explain, they just don't understand that a lot of their diet is based around carbohydrate, and therefore in their body, after digestion, they have high glucose levels. So at no point here in this sentence have I mentioned sugar, but effectively it's part of that sugar argument, because we're eating foods that are so high in simple carbohydrates that in a way they might just as well be sugar.
So you're talking about really simple carbohydrates here, the white flour-based products. The
crackers, the
bread,
flour, the starches.
pasta.
So you know your simple grains, your wheat, your rice. Any of the simple grains and any that are created into flours or starches, your potato starch, corn starch, any of those things, they will resolve in your body so quickly to high levels of blood glucose, and this can lead to inflammation and diabetes. So these poor people don't realise that their diet is having such a terrible impact because they don't understand the chemistry behind food science and digestion and what's happening when we eat simple carbohydrates. Even potatoes, are going to be high, and they are high in starches, so they will add to our blood glucose levels in a very detrimental way. And so for me, this is the confusion around sugar. So people intermittently use the words carbohydrate, sugar, glucose, fructose, so now no one knows what to eat.
And this is confusing. So what do people eat? How do we resolve this? Okay, the sugar bowl's gone up into the top cupboard for when Gran comes and visits, and I'm not putting sugar in my meals, but you've got to have a feed of pasta or pizza or...
Well, you really don't, but if you do, then you need to be aware of what you're eating. But you really don't need those foods. For me, the solution is, as it always is that we need to eat mainly natural whole foods, plant-based, as close to nature as possible. This way they'll be less refined, less processed, so that when we actually eat them, the biggest thing that saves us and saves our body from this huge, almost like tsunami of sugar that comes through our body every day is fibre. So the more closely that you eat foods that are in their natural whole state, the more fibre they'll have left in them intact, so that your body, as you break it down in the digestive process, has that fibre to help slow down the digestion and the release of those simple sugars. So therefore, the impact on your blood glucose level and your insulin balance won't be so severe, and it won't be as inflammatory to the body as it could be. So limit your processed foods. They contain way too much sugar. You need to read the nutrition labels or compare different brands, or just step away altogether. Do you remember that? I hate to promote one thing in particular, but there was that one scene in that sugar film which I loved, where he was actually saying that if you took away from the supermarket shelves everything that had sugar in it, added sugar to it, there would be something like 9% of product left on the shelf. And they did that whole thing, didn't they, where they removed... The shelves emptied, and it was left with really, really nothing. It was just hilarious. And it was like, wow, that was so impactful, I thought, that it really gives us an idea that everything that we're eating, even when we think we're making some fabulous choices, will have these hidden sugars.
Well, you can just imagine in the cereal aisle, the only thing left would be probably the rolled oats.
Oh, that's right. And that is the only thing that should be left, really, because who else wants to eat all that boxed nastiness? That's not real food. So for me, the solutions are you eat natural whole food, you limit the foods that come out of packets. The other way is...
I've got to tell you, people, this is funny. Ever since I met Caroline, when I saw her speaking the very first time, she used this term, if it's got a barcode on it, don't touch it.
That's right. If it's got a barcode, it's not food. Yeah, and that's still my standpoint. If you're opening a packet or a box or a container, it's probably not food. It's processed. So now you don't actually know how much sugar is in there,
or other things too. It's not just sugar. It's processed in order to have a barcode on it. Because generally speaking, a bean doesn't.
No, not avocados unless they put little stickers on. They so annoy me that you have to take the stickers off.
I agree.
And the apples.
Step back from that. Okay,
yeah, annoying. And so then the other solution is, the other thing to think about when we're putting our meals together is that in a similar way to making sure we have plenty of fibre still left in the foods that we're eating, you always want to combine your foods and your meals with protein and fat together, and then add some carbohydrate foods to help that. So you've got protein, fat and carbohydrate in the same meal. That will help us with our satiety and our feeling of fullness and satisfaction, because often what can happen is if we've got a meal that's mainly created from carbohydrate, within a couple of hours we're going to feel hungry again, and we're going to get those low blood sugar levels that make us a little bit cranky and a little bit craving for stuff. And so by, if you've eaten lunch this way, by 3 o'clock you're looking for something else, the sugar trolley or a coffee or something like that.
That's that sugar roller coaster that you can also get from just carbohydrates that I've mentioned in the past.
Yeah, and we touched on that as well when we did the podcast around diabetes. So it's about putting protein and fat in your meals with your carbohydrate foods. Now, your carbohydrate foods, they could be your vegetables, your breads, your pastas, the crackers, the rice, things that we've spoken about already. All of those are carbohydrate foods. And you want some of them during the day, and that's fine, particularly your vegetables. You need plenty of those, but they are still carbohydrate foods. And so you want to make sure you're combining them with your proteins and fats. And when you're eating whole natural vegetables, of course, they still have plenty of the fibre in them, which will help the sugars to resolve very slowly in the body, which is a positive thing.
Hey, I want to hear that. I think the listeners would love to hear it again, that rule of thumb about what you should have on your plate.
Okay, so I start with protein, fat, and a little bit of carbohydrate. And then I always make sure I fill up the plate, bowl, whatever it is that you've got, with lots of dark green leafy vegetables. And remembering that if you don't include fat, you're never going to feel full and satisfied. So you're always going to end up craving something. And people say to me, oh, no, I don't crave sugar. But when you look at what they're actually eating during that snack period, they're eating carbohydrates, which effectively in their body is sugar. So they do crave sugar. They're just not seeing it that way. You might be someone who describes yourself as a savoury type. It's the same deal because you're reaching for carbohydrates.
Guilty.
And I think many of us are. Yeah. Unless you're actually looking for and reaching for fat or protein-rich foods, then we are sugar craving. We just can't help ourselves. We're actually addicted to sugar. So, whatever form it comes in, we're looking for. So.
And that's because we've evolved, because sugar is so high dense and so rarely found in nature that when it's available, get into it.
Well, it's not dense, but it's energy giving. So it's easy to break down and gives us bang for buck way more energy than anything else. So for the body to actually get energy out of protein and fat, it has to work a lot harder. So it gets energy out of fruit very, very quickly. So, of course, if you're a caveman, you were sitting under a tree that suddenly there was a mulberry bush that was in season, you're going to sit there and gorge yourself on mulberries because you'll get loads of energy quickly. Plus, any energy that you don't use in that instant, the body will turn it into fat because it will store it for you for later on, which when we were evolving and we were cavemen and running around, that was fine. But we still have that mechanism going on today, and we're not running around. We're sitting on our bums most of the time, working or answering the phone or doing whatever it is that we're doing. So we've got all these stores in our body that we're not using, and it's just killing us.
And this is where we put on all that fat, isn't it?
Yeah, this is where we put on the extra weight and become diabetic. So we can still enjoy fresh whole fruit, but I wouldn't be eating too much. So often this is another mistake my clients make, is they've turned themselves into natural food eaters, which is awesome. So they're staying away from processed foods, but they've kind of filled the hole of taking away a lot of their carbohydrates. They've filled it up with fruit. So they're eating huge amounts of fruit now, which, yes, that's great because you've got lots of phytonutrients and there's fibre, etc., but there's an over consumption of the fructose. So keep fruit to a limit, 1 to 2 pieces a day, and I don't mean 1 or 2 blueberries. You can have half a cup of berries, and that makes 1 serve, or a couple of slices of watermelon. I'm not talking about eating a whole watermelon, but have 1 or 2 bits of fruit a day, and that's enough. We don't need to eat the whole tree anymore.
And this is a mistake. I've mentioned it before. I really fell foul of this one. Especially during the summer, I was eating probably 500 grams or more, maybe even up to 1 kilo at times of stone fruit a day.
Oh my gosh.
It was huge quantities.
And it's so yummy, it's so easy to do. I mean, who can stop at 1 mango?
But I was on the roller coaster. This is what I realise now. I'd start eating it in the morning and I was just on this roller coaster all day chasing it. It was just staggering. And then that went on to all sorts of other issues.
And so, I have many clients who are doing the same thing. So what I do with them is I get them to put in more fat with their meals, and that way they're feeling fuller and they're not reaching for the fruit. Because even though we know we're reaching for a healthy food, we're still reaching for the fruit because we haven't got enough protein and fat to keep us going during the day, and that's why we're reaching for the fruit.
And I've replaced it now with nuts.
Great.
I eat a couple of handfuls of nuts a day, and I eat very little fruit, 1 or 2 pieces, as you say. And it's all a lot better for me these days.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So just one last thing to cover just before we close really is not only we've spoken about natural sugars and we've spoken about sugars that come in processed foods, but the other thing to consider is, and this is where the food industry has really jumped on this bandwagon of people wanting to reduce their sugar intake, and so they've created artificial sweeteners, which on every level they're suggesting is perfectly safe for the body. But I have to say to you, I think that's utter garbage. There's not a single sweetener out there that I consider safe for the body. You need to avoid every single one. And I think a bit like smoking, in a few years' time, there'll be plenty more research. There is already research coming out talking about certain sugars that cause all sorts of problems in the body and with the liver in particular. And they will also add to our weight gain eventually. So avoid those sweeteners. I don't care what people are saying at the moment. I don't believe them. In, say, 5, 6, 7 years, we'll have plenty of research showing how harmful they are to the body.
Actually, bringing up artificial sweeteners is interesting. We should probably do a full episode at some stage. I'm not even saying the next little while on artificial sweeteners because I think it's a big topic and we could maybe...
that means I've got to go and find all that research. God.
Well, yeah, but, we can have I think it's a big one, actually.
It is, because a lot of people say, oh, well, I use stevia or I use this and I use that, and they're always trying to find something to put in their food, and it's like, no, I'd really love people to actually talk about whole foods. So let's eat whole foods, and if we can change our palate to a point where whole foods are tasting really yummy, you don't need to put sweetener in your food. The food tastes perfectly nice without it. If you're sweetening it, it's probably because the food doesn't taste very nice. Yeah.
So let's get down that rabbit hole a little bit later on that one. So if people aren't going to be using artificial sweeteners and they're not going to be using sugar, as they traditionally have done for years, what should people be using?
Well, preferably nothing, because I think often we use too much of everything anyway, and we don't actually need sweetener in the diet. But I know there's people out there groaning already. I can hear them. What do I put in my cake, even my raw cake? If you really feel that it needs some sweetening and you're not using fruit, then a raw organic honey would be reasonable, or even making your own date paste from organic dates. So you just take some dates and whip out the pips and then soak them in water for a couple of hours until they're nice and soft, and then just blend them up and they make a beautiful paste, and you can use 1 or 2 teaspoons to sweeten things as you go. But still, even all the raw stuff that's out there today, which is awesome and beautiful and uses lovely raw nuts and seeds and coconut and beautiful foods, they're putting way too much sweetener in. So even when we think we're making a better choice by having a raw little protein ball or something, it's still really high because they're using loads of dates and honey and maybe agave syrup and all sorts of things. So it's okay to have these things occasionally because they're a lovely treat and they taste delicious, and I'm as guilty as everybody else, but we really need to consider what we're doing and limit those kind of things in the diet.
Okay. Okay. So in the meantime, everyone, there are some emails, some comments that you can send our way. Email can be sent to carolinenutrition.com, and that's always easy, isn't it? But if you want to try Twitter, Caroline's Twitter handle is @CJRScott, whereas mine is @IanCath, and Cath is spelt with a K. So where are we heading in regards with this topic for the next episode? What's happening next time around?
Well, what I really wanted to discuss, because this is the way it plays out with my clients. So we have the big chat about sugar, and I get them to remove a lot of the carbohydrates from their diet, but then we're left with, well, what really is your diet looking like? How is it based? What's it formed on? So I'm always sharing with them what does my ideal diet and what does my perfect diet look like, and what it looks like, I've begun to realise over time, is creating an awful lot of controversy that I wasn't really aware of. So my perfect diet looks like low carbohydrate, healthy fat diet. Now, some people have said, oh, that's paleo. And I say, no, it's not. It doesn't really have a label. It's a whole plant food diet with lots of whole healthy foods. But it suddenly is creating an awful lot of controversy. So I really want to go into that next time and share what the controversy is and who's bringing the controversy to the table.
Okay, so stay tuned, everybody. That's where we're heading next. Let's see where we go with a good, healthy diet and some of the furore that is about that topic.
Yes, I can't wait.
Great. Thanks, Caroline. See you next time.
Thanks, Ian. Bye.
Bye.